All right. Honestly, I thought there was something else in the flow before me, so let me get my thoughts together for a minute. All right. Happy Sabbath, church. God is good, and all the time. Before I get into this here, like's been mentioned a few times, this is my last sermon for now as student pastor here at the church. And I did just want to thank all of you for allowing God to use all of us for the opportunities that I've had here. I'm very grateful, eternally grateful. And before I get any further, thank you for that. You'll see why that's there in a minute. But before I get any further, I would like to pray one more time because I think this is going to be an important message. So if you'll bow your heads with me, I'll let Pastor Rome get down the stairs first. Those stairs have been an issue before. Oh, dear Lord, thank you for today. Thank you for the Sabbath. I thank you that we're able to be here today. I pray, Lord, most importantly, that these words will not be my words, Lord. We have a tendency to get in our own way, and I pray that this will not be my words but your words, and it'll be the message that the church needs to hear today. I don't know how far this sermon might reach, as the wonders of the internet could take it pretty far. So I pray that everything I say and do will honor you and that it'll be your words, not mine. Amen. All right. You know, before we get into this, something that I was thinking about when I was sitting preparing mentally for this was there's kind of two sides to things, right? And for me, actually, this side, the reason for God, the intellectual side, it comes a little easier naturally for me. So when we talk about things like the reason for God, there comes disagreements and some controversy sometimes. And for me, the challenge actually comes in relating to people on that emotional level. So I encourage you, there may be things during this series that you may disagree with. There may be things that you have questions about. But like's been mentioned before, we love to talk about this stuff. So if you have any questions, maybe you have a disagreement with something Pastor Rome and I are saying, please come talk to us. We love to have those conversations. And I believe one of the most important things today is the importance of conversations and hearing each other out. So I just wanted to say that as a preface before we get into this message. But, oh yeah, I have the clicker that I very much trust to work. If we go on to the next slide here. See, it's slow. It gives a little bit of an effect to it. But we're doing the reason for God. This is part 3 of the series. And for those of you who may have missed the first 2 parts, you can kind of actually see it there. But we started off on the first Sabbath of July with the uncaused first cause, a pretty fitting start to the series, where we went over the evidence for a creator and our need for a creator in life and the meaning that gives us. And then last week, Pastor Rome went through the Christian synthesis, which is very much philosophy, which is right up Pastor Rome's alley, and I love hearing it. It's really good, and it helps us to understand our culture and where Christianity falls in the world today. And that brings us to part 3 today, which is the one I might be most excited for. It's called the straight line. Or maybe I could even phrase it this way, C.S. Lewis's straight line. And before we get into C.S. Lewis's straight line, as this is a church, and I want to remind us of the reason we're doing this series. Because I consider the reason that we're doing this series would be this verse right here. Anytime now. We already looked at it the first time. It is 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 15. And in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 15, Peter says, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give a reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect." Church, we as believers ought to be able to give an answer for the reason that the hope that we have. We're in church because we have hope. We have hope of the Advent, the second coming. And we ought to be able to give a reason for the hope that we have. And that's why we have this series based off this book by Timothy Keller, The Reason for God. And the subtext is belief in an age of skepticism. Today, when we talk about the straight line, I thought of how we need God. I have it written in my notes here in all caps, we need God. But what is this need? Why do we need God? And what role is God filling? Because when we say we need God, we're saying that there's a hole that he has to fill. What do we mean when we say we need God? I think most of us can agree we need him, but what do we mean by that? I wrote this down. Our need for him, in and of itself, just the fact that we need him, is evidence in and of itself for his existence and a reason for his existence. Our need for him is evidence for him, and we need him like we need food or like we need water. It's like sustenance to us. We need him because this hole exists that he needs to fill. It's often referred to as a God-sized hole. As this series is based off of the straight line of C.S. Lewis, another thing C.S. Lewis said in our need for God, he said, quote, in Mere Christianity, I'll put it on the screen for you so you can read together, actually. Anytime now. This is why I'm scared to use the clicker. But it should be right there. I'll start reading it and hope it comes up afterwards. If I find in myself desires for which nothing in this world can satisfy, the only logical explanation is I was made for another world. And C.S. Lewis, when he said this, had just finished talking about how we need food, and there's such a thing as food. We need water, there's such a thing as water. And we need God, and there's such a thing as God. But it's not in this world that we find that fulfillment. It's something above. It's a standard outside of you and I that fulfills this need, that proves that we were made for another world. Now, we touched on the moral argument in part 1 because we went through the evidence for a creator God, and one of the evidence that there needs to be, well, in the very least that theism needs to be true, is the moral argument. But I thought we'd go all in on the moral argument because that's what C.S. Lewis talks about when he talks about the straight line. Now, before we do that, we ought to go through the journey of C.S. Lewis so we get a background of what he meant when he talked about this straight line. C.S. Lewis, for those of you who don't know, I think most of us know him from one place or another. He wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. That's a place most people know him from. He also is one of the most influential Christian apologists of the past, I'd say 200 years. He's up there. He wrote many books other than Narnia, like Mere Christianity. The Screwtape Letters is an interesting one. Lewis started off, for those of you who don't know, as an atheist. He was not a believer in God. He was definitely almost anti-theist, not interested in it at all. But he found this need for God that we're talking about here. And like was mentioned before in part 1, there's kind of 2 steps to Christian apologetics. There's kind of the step that gets you to theism, which could be Judaism, Islam, or Christianity, or other theistic religions. Lewis got there first, but of course that didn't satisfy him enough because he hadn't found Christ yet. He was a theist, but not a Christian. It was actually in a conversation with J.R.R. Tolkien that convinced him to become a Christian when Tolkien referred to him, Christ, as the one true myth. The one true myth. But before he got there, he had to become a theist. And this is what C.S. Lewis said in Mere Christianity about his journey from atheism to theism, from believing in no God to believing in a God. He said this. I'll put it on the screen too. I should get ahead of it next time. There we go. He said this. My argument against God, his reason he wasn't a Christian, was this. The universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of what a straight line looks like. What was I comparing the universe when I called it unjust? Lewis realized that his primary reason for not believing in God was not evidence. It was his emotional problem with the evil in the world. But then he realized, wait a minute, what do I even mean by that? What do I mean by evil? When I call the universe unjust, what am I comparing it to? That must mean I have some idea of what a just universe looks like. The terms just and unjust are implying a standard. But Lewis didn't have this standard without God. So he realized his need for him. And that brought him to theism. Just to give you a little background, by the way, about Lewis, he was probably fair to say that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. His mother died of cancer when he was 10 years old. He had problems. He had a rough life. No one was saying that it's unfair to say the universe is unjust. But the problem comes in what he means by that, and where is he getting the standard of unjust? By the way, when Lewis did finally become a Christian, he referred to himself as the most reluctant convert in all of England. He didn't even want to become a Christian. He just felt he had to, based off the evidence that was there. Now, this is a very good way to sum up the moral argument with this line. And much of our debate these days, much of the things that's tearing our society apart, is about moral debate. We're talking about, is this thing right? Is this thing wrong? What's moral? What's immoral? Well, that kind of goes back to God, doesn't it? Once again, these debates we have, kind of God's in the center of it, whether we realize it or not. But like in all things, specifically like the line, we ought to have a standard. We didn't create the line, we discovered it. As Pastor Rome said to me yesterday when we were talking, I thought that was really good. We didn't create this line, which is God, by the way, if you haven't clicked that yet. The line is the standard, that is God. But we discovered it. Now, I want to put a picture on the screen, but before I do that, we all know what the Mona Lisa looks like, right? Mona Lisa is beautiful. We all agree on that? It's objectively a beautiful painting. Well, if I were to draw this right here, is that as beautiful as the Mona Lisa? If we put that picture on the screen, just to give you a bit of a comparison. Well, hold on a second. So that's a line, by the way. I drew that up there too. That's a line, once again, comparison. And then if we put the Mona Lisa up on the screen, just take a look at that and take a look at that. We all agree there's a difference. One of these is better than the other one. Now, how do we know that? Well, I'm no artist, but I mean, you can clearly see the shading, the detail, the colors, the accuracy. All these standards that we have when it comes to art tell us that that is more beautiful than that. But we have a standard, because if there was no standard of what good art was, you actually couldn't say that that's more beautiful. But we all agree that it is more beautiful. I have another example here of, this might be my favorite one. And it'll be there, maybe. There we go. I did this in the Bible Foundations class over at AAA. I just put 2 + 2 = 4 on the screen, and then looked at him like I was a geometry teacher and said, prove it. Well, we all agree again that 2 + 2 = 4, I would hope. If somebody wants to question me on that, I guess you can, but 2 + 2 = 4, right? Because there's this thing that's a standard of mathematics. We all agree that 2 + 2 = 4 because we know what math is, and we all agree on this objective standard of math. There's another one used in philosophy. It's called chairness, and we went over in the Apologetics group. And when you look at a chair, I don't know, is there a chair in here somewhere? You know what a chair looks like, right? That's exactly the point, I guess. Even though there's not a chair right here, we all agree on what a chair looks like. Because we have a standard outside of us that says, that's objective, that's what a chair is. We know what a chair looks like. And when we look at something and say, that's a chair, we say that's a chair because we know what a chair is, even without physically having a chair right with us. It is the same with morality. Morality is a standard, and moral claims imply a moral standard. Just like 2 + 2 = 4 implies math, moral claims imply a moral standard. One more example I threw in here is Plato's parable. And in this parable, there's a bunch of guys who are tied up in a cave their whole life. They've never left this cave. In front of them, they see the wall of the cave. Behind them, there's a hole that lets the light in. They can't see this hole. They don't know that they're in a cave. They're just hanging there, and they see shadows of what's on the outside. So they see a rabbit go by this hole, and the rabbit's shadow goes onto the wall. So all these guys think, oh, that's a rabbit. They think the shadow is a rabbit. But the story goes that Plato tells is that one of the guys gets out. He gets out of the cave, and he sees what an actual rabbit looks like. He sees what actual grass, what the sun is. He realizes that he was only seeing reflections of the real thing, or of the standard. Kind of like the story we told before on the first part. It doesn't end so well because the story goes that the guy goes back into the cave to tell these guys, I found the real thing. And they kill him because, well, they didn't like what he had to say. But you need a standard. Just like in that case, you have the real world and you have how we perceive it. We have morality. We have a standard of what morality is. And this brings us kind of to our current debates we have today. And one thing that I've seen a lot on the moral arguments is moral relativism. You all know what I mean when I say moral relativism. Essentially is the opposite of what we've just been talking about. There is no standard. It's when you hear someone say like, my truth, or your truth, or there's no like actual standard, it's just your opinion against mine. You hear this a lot today. What concerns me is that moral relativism seems to be an attempt to erase God. It seems to be exactly the point of it is to get rid of the standard, which is God, which is the God we worship. And it's like saying, to use the 2 plus 2 example, saying you have your own truth is kind of like saying, I have my own math, or I have my own standard of what a color is. It doesn't follow. We have erased the line in many of our dialogues today. And we as a church, going back to 1 Peter 3:15, ought to know how to give an answer for the hope that we have. Now, C.S. Lewis in that quote, if we go back to that quote and we remember that his first thing he said was, my argument against God is the universe seems so cruel and unjust. There's another name for the point he's bringing up there. I think we've all heard it. It's called the problem of evil, right? This is the biggest reason that someone isn't a believer, is the problem of evil. Often when someone doesn't believe there's a God, it's not because of like a factual or evidential thing. It's because of the problem of evil in the world, which again, like I mentioned before, it's kind of fair, isn't it? The world is messed up. So how do we respond to that? We as Adventists actually have a unique response to this. This is another thing that came out of Pastor Roman and I's discussion yesterday. We as Adventists have a little bit different of a theology when it comes to some of these key issues. And when it comes to engaging these conversations about the problem of evil, we have a bit of a different response. Because wouldn't you say like the greatest evil in the world is death? Like we don't like death. Death is evil. It's wrong. Well, we have a different view of death in the Adventist belief system, that we go to sleep. As Jesus said about Lazarus, we go to sleep. I'm reminded of back in December, I quoted Frank Turek 2 weeks ago. Frank Turek actually came over here to the state of Washington. I was like, oh, I like what this guy has to say most of the time. He's not an Adventist, by the way, which made this conversation interesting, but I like what he has to say most of the time. So I drove over to Federal Way and went to this seminar he did. I listened to it. It was a great seminar on how I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, is what he called it. But in the end, I said, well, I agree with a lot of the stuff he says, but it would be more interesting if I go up and ask a question about something I disagree with. So I went up there and asked him about the state of the dead doctrine and used kind of an analogy and said, well, when Lazarus dies, if he goes straight up to heaven, doesn't Jesus like pull him back down to earth? If I was Lazarus, I'd want to stay up there. So, and I used this example really because I didn't think I was actually going to change Frank Turek's mind. But I did think maybe I could get people thinking in the audience. And I went back and watched this video. It's on YouTube. And I could see exactly that. There's this one guy sitting in there, and he's like laughing his head off at this. I doubt he agreed with me, but he certainly never thought about it that way. But we as Adventists have a unique response to this problem of evil because we actually have in common with the atheists the idea that when you're dead, you're asleep. So in that sense, when it comes to executing 1 Peter 3:15 and giving an answer, we have a unique answer. And I think Pastor Rome said many times about these situations where he stumps people bringing this up because they assume that we as Christians believe that you go straight to heaven when you die. Well, we have an interesting response that'll get people thinking. That's always my goal, is to get people thinking. But that was a little bit of a tangent off the problem of evil, because it is the age-old question, the problem of evil. And it's everywhere. I really mean it. It's everywhere. I hear things like this. I have some of these things written down. There is no God, and I hate him. You hear that a lot. That's a little bit of a contradiction. It's kind of like you have to sit in God's lap to spit in his face, often with these arguments. And speaking of Frank Turek wrote a book called Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case in the First Place. Like you're taking the standard, that line, you take the line away from God, even though he himself is the line. We take the line and use it to argue against him when we say that the world is so cruel and unjust. And that's the realization C.S. Lewis had. I was sitting in the movie theater the other day watching the new Marvel movie, Thor: Love and Thunder. I was going to go into a more in-depth analogy, but then I realized maybe somebody hasn't seen it, and these Marvel movies are pretty big. I'm getting the thumbs up. I'm not going to spoil the movie. For those of you who have seen it, we'll talk in code a little bit. So that opening scene, right? The main villain. Think about his motivation, for those of you who've seen the movie. Think about why he does the things he does in the movie. It's essentially the problem of evil, isn't it? That's essentially his motivation. This guy, throughout the movie, does some awful things. And this secular Marvel movie is touching on the problem of evil, and most audience doesn't even realize it. Before that movie came out, there was another movie that touches on a very similar issue. And that movie actually, I don't really particularly care for this movie. It came out like 6 years ago, but Batman versus Superman, Dawn of Justice, you guys remember that movie? Well, in the movie, there should be a quote up here. Oh, I think I rearranged the slides. Bear with me here. There we go. Lex Luthor, who's the villain of Superman, for those of you who know, he says this, in a secular superhero movie, he said this: if God is all-powerful, he cannot be all good. And if he is all good, he cannot be all-powerful. It's in our entertainment. It's everywhere. And it just floors me that it seeps into everything. None of these movies give an answer, though, by the way, to these questions. They pose the questions, they don't give an answer. And Lex Luthor, by the way, this is kind of a little bit of plagiarism here, because he took that from a philosopher named Epicurus. He doesn't mention that, though, in the movie. He's saying that to Superman, by the way, in the movie. Now, some may wonder, why are you using secular movies in a sermon? Well, for one, I think it resonates with us because it's the world we live in. And for two, Paul did the same thing when he used pagan philosophy to bring people to Christ. And the point in bringing these up is to show that this problem seeps into everything. It seeps into even our secular movies, and I doubt the people who made these movies even realized what they were saying. But we ought to know how to answer this one. We ought to know what answer to give, going back to 1 Peter 3:15. We can answer by giving the line, but I also thought we'd look at how Jesus answered the problem of evil. Now, this will be an interesting response, and that's the quote that was just up there. I jumped ahead a little bit. If you want to turn with me to Luke chapter 13, Jesus addressed the problem of evil, and you have to kind of read the subtext that Luke gives. If you go to Luke chapter 13, the very beginning, Luke gives a little bit of background, as Luke does as a historian. He says, now there were some present at the time who told Jesus about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices. So just to pause for a second, they're telling Jesus about this horrible thing that has happened. These people come to Jesus and they say, hey, Jesus, basically saying, why does evil happen? Why did you allow this horrible thing to happen? Look at Jesus' response. He says, do you think that these Galileans were worse sinners than the other Galileans because they suffered this way? I tell you, no. But unless you repent, you too will perish. Or these 18 who died in the Tower of Siloam when it fell on them, do you think they were more guilty than the others living in Jerusalem? I tell you, no. Now, why do I bring this up? Somebody may hear that and say, that's not a great answer. Essentially, what Jesus is saying there is, we live in a sinful world. This world's messed up. And that is that's what Jesus is trying to start off with, because back then, many people, and this is the subtext of this question, they believed in essentially the idea of karma. They said, oh, the Tower of Siloam fell? Well, they must have been guilty of something. Those guys, they must have had some secret sin that they were hiding because, well, evil things don't just happen to people just because. They were trying to make sense of morality. They were trying to make sense of the line. And C.S. Lewis explains in a roundabout way how evil actually proves that there must be that line. But this doesn't seem to be a super satisfying answer on the emotional level, does it? Because we have these ideas, okay, fine. We believe there's a God, but we're still left wondering why this God allows evil. You know, I wish that we could do a whole series really on the problem of evil as a whole and the satisfying answers to that. But I do remember in one of the first apologetics classes we did here at AAA a couple years ago was Pastor Rome asked that question basically, like why does God allow evil? I had been studying this. This is one of the first answers you got to find when you're looking for answers in apologetics. I remember raising my hand just being like, free will, 2 words, free will. And although this may not be a perfect, satisfying answer that'll satisfy every question you have, when God created Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, do you know that love, by definition, has to be freely given? It can't be forced. If somebody says, I love you so much, I'm going to force you to love me, that's not love. As Pastor Rome once said, we have our own definitions of love. And that's not love. So God had to give us free will in order to choose him. Now, we also can choose not to follow him. But that doesn't mean that this standard that must exist either way doesn't love us. Because he shows for us that while we are still sinners, Christ died for us. The standard must exist, as we've seen. And we see now that although we may not find all the answers, Christ shows us that this standard, this God that must exist, does indeed love us. And that ties into the Christian synthesis. Now, before we go on to the next part, because there's so much, I wish I could say more, and I had to condense a lot into one sermon, but going back to the book, the namesake of this series, The Reason for God, Timothy Keller talks about the problem of evil in much that intellectual way that's very relevant to us today. And Tim Keller, I mentioned this when we started this series, but he's actually a pastor in New York, so he knows a thing or two about having these conversations. I bookmarked it. I didn't flip to it that fast. He says this: if there is no God, then there is no way to say that one action is moral and another immoral, but only I like this or I like that. In that case, who gets the right to put their subjective, arbitrary moral feelings into law? It's relevant, isn't it? It's a tough question to ask. But this once again goes back to the standard of God, that we need him. We started off, the first thing brought up was that we need him. Well, we need him because we have to have a standard. We have to have that necessary God-sized hole filled. And C.S. Lewis found this through the straight line. We use the straight line analogy because I think he sums it up really well. You know what C.S. Lewis said at the end of his journey, after he had finished this journey, towards the end of his life, I believe he said this. He said, Christianity, if false, it's of no importance. But if it's true, it's of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important. It's either everything or it's nothing. There's no middle ground. There's no if, and, or buts. Either the standard exists, and you and I have a God that we ought to worship, or the standard doesn't exist, and none of this matters at all. We are all wasting our time. There's only two options. Now, the question is, how do we get to that line? Because every good sermon ends with that call to action, and that how does it apply to you today? Well, we've talked about this line. How do we get there? And how do you and I get there? Well, is there multiple ways to this line? Is there many ways to God, as some might suggest? I heard a while back, it was probably about a year ago at this point, Steve Harvey, we know Steve Harvey, host of Family Feud, he does a lot of other stuff. He came out one time and said, oh, I don't believe there's just one way to God. There's many, many ways to God. He referred to it like there's thousands of channels on TV, and all of them bring you entertainment. There's many different ways to God. First of all, he is a comedian, he's funny, right? But what is that accurate? Is that true? Well, Timothy Keller, in his Reason for God, foreshadows this, and it's a good segue into what Pastor Rome will talk about next Sabbath. Is Jesus the only way to that line? And Timothy Keller says this about, is Jesus the only way? It is no more narrow to claim that one religion is right than to claim that one way to think about all religions, namely that they're all equal, is right. We are all exclusive in our beliefs about religion, but in different ways. You ever think about that? Because I hear it all the time. Hey, you're so exclusive with your Christianity. You're saying that's the only way to get to the line? Well, aren't you being exclusive and claiming that my view is exclusive? I'll leave the rest of that fun conversation to Pastor Rome, but when we talk about the line and our need for the line, and need, I'm emphasizing it in all caps because of how important it is. You know, one of the most common conversations I have when someone comes to me and asks tough questions is, Payton, how can I believe in Christianity if this Christian did this horrible thing to me? Or that Christian did this horrible thing to me? All the time have this happen. Oh, this pastor, he let me down. Oh, this friend or this church member, he let me down. And people allow this to stop them from pursuing God. And it hurts me. And I always try to say the same thing, and I often don't feel like people fully hear it because it's so hard. It hurts. Believe me, I've had Christians let me down too. But we've talked about this line the whole time. And guess what, church? That line, it's immovable, eternal, unchanging. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And what I always tell these people is, don't look at people. Don't look at people. They will let you down every single time without fail. If you assume a person will not let you down, you're already starting off wrong. Look at him. He doesn't change. He's that eternal line that we need. And we need him. And our need for him in and of itself is evidence for him. And that, church, is the reason for God. We need him. What are we without him? Leave it there.